The captive, the cold metal walls of the chamber hummed with the sound of engines deep within the human vessel, and Lyra sat huddled in the corner with her thin limbs folded close to her body, her eyes wide with dread as she thought again of the stories whispered in the nursery caverns of her home world. Every child in her colony had grown up fearing the name of humans. They were told humans were giants of flesh who roamed the stars, hunting weaker races to tear apart and consume their flesh. They were described as ruthless beings who grew strong from the bodies of others and carried no mercy in their hearts. Whenever she closed her eyes, she saw those tales replayed in her mind. She had never believed she would one day face the nightmare herself, yet here she was trapped in a chamber aboard a human ship, waiting for the moment they would open the door and drag her away. Her capture had happened so quickly. Her shuttle had been intercepted while carrying a message between frontier colonies. The humans had surrounded them, their ships huge and glowing with blue thrusters. Her pilot had tried to flee, but the humans had disabled the vessel with precision and boarded. Before anyone could resist, she remembered the sound of boots striking the deck, the heavy steps of tall figures in dark armor. Her companions had screamed and scattered, but she had frozen, and the next thing she knew, she was brought here separated from everyone else. She expected torment, she expected hunger in their eyes, but instead what she found was silence. They locked her inside, but they had not touched her. They had not clawed or bitten. She sat trembling, thinking it was only a matter of time. Hours passed, her body shook with cold and fear. She wondered if they wanted her weak before the feast, her stomach cramped from hunger, yet she dared not touch the strange food they had left. A tray of soft bread-like substance, a bowl of liquid that steamed with heat, and some slices of fruit with a sweet scent. She remembered the stories saying humans would sometimes feed their victims to make their flesh tastier. So she pushed the tray away and waited. When the door finally opened, the hiss of air made her flinch. A tall figure stepped in. He was different from what she had imagined. His face was bare, his eyes calm, not burning with cruelty, but steady and sharp. He carried no weapon, and in his hand he held another tray with more food. His voice rumbled low when he spoke words she could not understand. She shrank back, pressing herself against the wall. He placed the tray gently on the floor between them and slowly stepped back, his movements careful, almost like one would use to approach a wounded creature. Lyra expected him to lunge at her at any moment, yet he did not. Instead, he gave a small nod and left, leaving the food untouched between them. This confused her more than anything. She had prepared herself for pain and for the end. But what was this game? Were they testing her? Were they waiting for her to eat before taking her away? She could not make sense of the time. Blurred inside the chamber, she tried to rest, but every sound of footsteps outside made her jolt awake. She remembered the face of the human, the strange calm in his eyes. She thought about the way he had placed the tray with care. It did not fit the image of a monster, and that unsettled her even more. Eventually, the door opened again. The same man entered, this time carrying a small device. He pressed a button and a clear voice spoke in her own tongue, though slightly distorted. "You are safe. No harm will come to you." Her entire body stiffened. She hissed a whisper of disbelief. No harm? That could not be true. She remembered the stories of human tricks, the way they lured and deceived before devouring. They would say kind words to break the spirit of their prey. She glared at him, but inside she felt something shifting. Man repeated his words again, slowly. "You are safe. You are not food." The translator buzzed with each syllable. She stared at him, uncertain. His tone was not mocking, not cruel, simply steady. She did not answer. She pressed her arms tighter around herself, her thin frame trembling with conflict. The human did not press further. He only set the device down so that it remained in the room, and then left. Once more she listened to the silence, and then to the faint hum of the ship. Her thoughts spun like a storm. Could it be that everything she had learned was wrong? Or was this simply a deeper layer of the trap? Her hunger gnawed at her. The sweet scent of the fruit filled the chamber. The bread looked harmless. The liquid gave off warmth. She resisted until her strength faltered, her limbs weak and her body aching. Finally, with a shaking hand, she reached out and took the smallest bite of fruit. The taste burst across her tongue, sweet and pure, not poisoned, not laced with strange fire. She waited for pain, but none came, only the quiet comfort of food. Her eyes watered with both relief and confusion. Why would monsters give her something that healed instead of harmed? She ate more until the edge of hunger eased, and then curled up on the floor, her mind torn. She remembered her mother telling her stories of human cruelty. She remembered her elders pointing to the stars, saying, "Beware the devourers, they will find you, and they will feast." And now she was here among them, and none of it matched what she had been told. As she drifted into restless sleep, she thought of the human officer, his calm gaze, his strange patience, the translator's voice echoing in her head. "You are safe," she wanted to believe, but fear still clung to her heart. Her last thought before slumber claimed her was not of being eaten, but of a question she had never dared to ask before. What if the stories were lies, the misunderstanding? When the soft light of the chamber brightened to signal a new cycle, Lyra stirred awake, her body stiff from the hard floor and her mind heavy with questions. The taste of the fruit still lingered on her tongue, and it felt unreal that she was alive and unharmed. She stretched, her limbs slowly blinking at the untouched bread and warm drink that remained by her side. Nothing about this made sense. If humans truly wished to consume her, then why leave her alive this long, and why waste their own food on her? The confusion gnawed at her as much as the hunger had the day before. The sound of the door opening drew her attention, and once again the tall human officer stepped inside, this time without any tray in his hands. Instead, he carried the same device that translated his words. He pressed the small button and spoke in his own language, and then the machine repeated in her tongue, "Can you understand me?" She hesitated before giving a small nod. Her voice cracked as she whispered yes, though her chest tightened with suspicion. Human gave a slight smile and sat down on the opposite side of the room, keeping distance between them as if to avoid frightening her. He said, "You are not a prisoner. We only brought you here because your vessel was damaged and your people fired at us." She frowned at the translation. The words felt strange. Prisoner, damaged vessel. These were not the words of a predator, but she could not allow herself to believe too quickly. Her thoughts raced. She remembered the boarding humans entering her shuttle. She remembered her pilot screaming and falling when a pulse of light struck the console. In her mind, that had been an act of hunting, but perhaps it had been something else. The officer continued, "We want no harm. Your safety is important." She narrowed her eyes, unsure if this was more trickery. He motioned towards the food that remained near her and asked, "Why you do not eat?" Lyra wrapped her arms around herself and hissed quietly, "Because you want me fat for feast." The translator buzzed as it repeated her words, and she saw his brows rise in confusion, and then his lips parted in what she recognized as laughter. Not cruel laughter, but surprise. He shook his head slowly and leaned forward, his voice calm. "No, we do not eat others like you. We eat plants and animals from our own farms, not people." His words struck her like a stone against glass. The belief she had carried her whole life cracked, though she still resisted the break. How could that be true? Every story, every warning from her elders had painted humans as devourers. Perhaps he was lying to lower her guard. Perhaps the real feast waited beyond the chamber. She whispered, "I do not believe," and turned her face away. The officer did not force her. He only placed the translator on the ground closer to her and left again, the door closing with a hiss. She sat staring at the small device as if it were a trap waiting to snap shut, yet the machine only hummed quietly, repeating no more words. Her thoughts spun through the hours until at last she could not resist the hunger again. She took more fruit and sipped the warm drink, her body filled with strength and calm, and no pain followed later. When the officer returned, he did not come alone. A second human entered, carrying a small kit. They moved carefully, as though afraid she might lash out. The second human knelt and revealed tools for healing, gently gesturing toward the cuts on her arms left from the crash. Drew back fearful, but the officer raised a hand and spoke softly. The translator echoed, "We only heal, no harm." Please let us help." Her breath caught in her chest. No enemy had ever spoken like that. She held still as the second human cleaned and covered her wounds. The sting was brief, but then warmth spread, and the pain dulled. She blinked in shock, staring at her arm wrapped neatly with clean fabric. The human stood back when the task was done, and waited for her reaction. She could not hide the trembling in her limbs. Her mind rebelled against the sight of enemies offering kindness. She whispered again, more to herself than them, "Why you do this? Why heal me if you plan to eat?" The translator echoed the words aloud, and the officer answered, steady and calm, "We do this because it is right, because no one should suffer, not even an enemy." That night Lyra did not sleep. The chamber felt different, no longer only a cage, but also a place where questions burned inside her. She remembered the touch of gentle hands cleaning her wounds, and the steady eyes of the officer. She remembered his words, and the strange way they stirred something new in her chest. She wanted to believe, yet fear clung tight around her heart. The next cycle brought more changes. This time, the officer did not take her to the mess hall at once. Instead, he invited her through gestures, and the translator to follow him down the corridor. At first, she resisted, her thin limbs trembling at the thought of being led to slaughter, but his gaze remained patient and without threat, so at last she rose and stepped cautiously into the wide passage. The air smelled cleaner and warmer here. She walked behind him, her senses sharp, waiting for any sign of ambush. When they reached the hall, she froze. Dozens of humans sat around long tables eating together, their voices rising in laughter and talk. The smell of strange food filled the air, rich and heavy, but none of them looked at her with hunger in their eyes. None rose to seize her. They only glanced curiously and then continued eating. The officer guided her to a corner and set down a tray of fruit, grains, and water. Then he picked up a piece of bread from his own plate and bit into it, slowly chewing and swallowing. As if to show her the food was safe, he nodded toward her tray. She hesitated and then touched the food again, her body calming slightly with every bite. For the first time, she realized they did not treat her as prey. They treated her as one of their own, though at a distance, and with caution. When she whispered to the translator about the stories of her people, that humans feasted on the living, the soldiers nearby laughed, but not with cruelty, instead with shock and disbelief. One of them said through the machine, "No, we are not monsters who told you this." And she looked down, ashamed, unable to answer. Her heart beat fast with confusion and something else, something close to relief. The weight of fear was still heavy, but cracks were spreading and light was seeping in. She remembered again the officer's words, "You are not food," and though she wanted to doubt them, a small fragile part of her began to wonder if it could be true. Breaking the walls, Lyra had never thought she would walk freely among humans, yet the cycles passed, and slowly the chamber that once felt like a cage became only a place to rest. The officer, whose name she had learned through the translator as Daniel, continued to approach her with patience, never forcing her, never raising his voice. He spoke to her in calm tones, repeating simple phrases so that she could learn their meaning beyond the machine. Sometimes he would bring her fruit and name it slowly, apple, berry, melon, and he would wait for her to try repeating the sounds. She did not understand why he cared to teach her, but she felt a quiet warmth when she managed to speak a word correctly. And he gave a small smile. At first she thought all of this was still some long trick, yet the longer she watched them, the less the idea made sense. These people were busy with their duties. They repaired parts of the ship, they cleaned, they shared meals, they laughed at stories. She could not understand if they were hunters. Then why spend so much time building and fixing? Why smile at one another with such joy? There was no hunger in their eyes when they looked at her, only curiosity, and sometimes kindness, and that frightened her in a different way, because it meant that everything she had believed since childhood might be built on lies one day. Daniel guided her again to the mess hall, where the crew gathered for a shared meal. She hesitated at the doorway, her limbs tense, but he walked slowly ahead of her and sat at one of the long tables, motioning for her to sit near. She lowered herself onto the bench, glancing around at the dozens of humans eating their food with metal tools. Their Voices blending into a steady hum of talk and laughter. No one pounced on her. No one stared with teeth. Bared instead a soldier across the table slid a small round fruit toward her and spoke in a friendly tone. Daniel pressed the translator, and she heard the words, "He says it is good. You should try." She picked it up with shaking hands, staring at the smooth red skin, and Daniel gave a short nod before taking one himself and biting into it, the sound of the fruit breaking the juice running down his chin startled her, but then he smiled as if to say, "See, it is safe." With her heart racing, she lifted the fruit to her mouth and took a cautious bite. The sweet flavor filled her tongue, and she blinked in surprise. It was nothing like the bitter rations her people stored on their ships. This was bright and fresh. She took another bite, and then another until the fruit was gone. The humans around her smiled softly at her simple joy, and she lowered her gaze, ashamed of how much she had feared. Then that night, when she returned to her chamber, she could not stop thinking about the way they laughed at the tale she had told of her elders, warning that humans devoured living beings. They had not mocked her with cruelty, but had looked at one another in shock, asking how such a story could exist. She curled on the floor, whispering to herself, "Why would my people lie? Why teach us to fear them?" She did not know the answer, but she knew that the fear inside her was beginning to change into something else. Another cycle passed, and Daniel came again with the translator. He asked gently about her home, about the stories of humans. She remembered. She spoke in slow words, the device buzzing as it carried her meaning. She told him that her mother said humans hunted the stars, they captured prey, and gained strength by devouring the flesh of others. She remembered the hollow voice of her elder, warning never to approach human ships for they would tear you apart. Daniel listened without anger, only with a deep sadness in his eyes. When she finished, he spoke firmly through the translator, "Your elders lied. We are not beasts. We eat plants and animals we raise on farms. We do not eat people." His certainty shook her. She stared at him long and hard, searching for some trace of deceit, but his gaze held steady and calm. She turned away, feeling her heart twist inside her chest. If what he said was true, then her people had lived in fear of shadows that did not exist. She asked quietly, "Then why attack our ship? Why bring me here?" Daniel answered, "Because your ship carried weapons meant to harm us. We stopped it, but you were not the target. You were caught in the middle." His words struck her with confusion again. If this was true, then the war she had been warned about was not what she thought. The walls she had built inside her mind for so long began to crack. She remembered the careful way the medic had cleaned her wounds. She remembered the laughter in the hall, the warmth of the fruit in her hands, the steady tone of Daniel repeating, "You are safe." Every memory stood against the picture of monsters she had been taught to fear. Her breath came in shivers as she whispered, "Maybe I was wrong." Daniel leaned closer and said, gently, "Not wrong, only misled, and now you can see truth." From that day she began to walk more often among them, guided always by Daniel, but welcomed by others as well. She saw their work, their tired faces after long hours, their joy when repairs went well. She began to learn their words without the machine's simple greetings. "Thank you, my name is Lyra," and each time they encouraged her with soft voices and smiles. Yet deep inside, the battle still raged. She could not erase the stories of her childhood. So quickly she felt guilt for doubting her elders, and fear that perhaps she was the one falling into a clever trap. But every time a human passed her food without demand, every time a medic checked her healing wounds, every time Daniel spoke to her with patience, she felt the old fear shrinking like shadows chased away by light. One evening, as she sat by the viewing window looking out at the endless field of stars, Daniel sat beside her and asked through the translator, "What do you think of humans?" Now she was silent for a long while, her eyes fixed on the glittering horizon. Then she whispered, "I do not know. I feared you would eat me, but you did not. You gave me food. You gave me healing. You speak kindly. I am confused." Daniel only nodded and said, "Confusion is the first step to learning truth." Heart felt heavy, yet lighter than before, as if something new was growing inside her, something fragile that could one day become trust. and she realized that perhaps the walls she had lived behind her whole life were finally beginning to fall. Truth and trust days turned into weeks aboard the human vessel, and Lyra no longer felt the same trembling fear she had carried when she first arrived. She still carried doubt inside her heart, but it was no longer the heavy chain that once pressed her down. It was now a small whisper in the back of her thoughts, a whisper that grew weaker every time she saw the humans laugh together or work tirelessly beside one another. She began to see that their strength was not born from devouring others, but from the way they stood together side by side, helping one another without hesitation. Daniel continued to guide her gently through their world, showing her their halls, their machines, their routines. He explained in simple words how their ships were powered, how their farms aboard other vessels grew food, how they traveled not to conquer, but to explore and to trade. The more she listened, the more her old stories sounded hollow and thin, like shadows stretched across a wall, and every time she tried to cling to them, they slipped further away. One evening, she stood at the window where the stars poured like rivers of light across the endless dark. Daniel stood beside her and spoke through the translator. He said, "Your people believe lies about us, and I fear the lies were made for control, not for truth." His words struck her harder than she expected, for deep down she had already begun to wonder why her elders filled the young with so much fear. She thought of her mother whispering at night about monsters she had never seen, and she wondered if her mother too had only repeated what was told, never daring to question. The next cycle brought a shift when a message arrived from her people. The ship's communication system lit up, and Daniel told her with a grave expression that her commander demanded her return. He explained that her leaders threatened war if the humans did not release her at once. Lyra felt her chest tighten as she listened. She could hear the edge of anger in the words of her people. Even through the translator, they spoke of betrayal and claimed she was being tortured. She wanted to scream that it was not true, that the humans had done nothing but care for her. But the weight of her people's command pressed on her like stone. Daniel looked at her then, and his voice was calm but heavy. "You have a choice. You can return to them and live by their stories, or you can stay here and see for yourself what truth is." Lyra could not answer. At once her mind spun in chaos. The old fear clashed with the new warmth she had found here. She thought of the medic's gentle hands. She thought of the soldier who had given her fruit. She thought of Daniel's patient gaze. She thought of the laughter of the humans and the taste of their food. None of it matched the image of devourers. Yet if she stayed, would her people call her traitor? The humans did not lock her in the chamber. They let her walk the corridors freely. They let her think. They did not force her decision. They trusted her to choose, and that trust itself made her heart tremble, because she knew her own leaders would never have done the same. That night, she could not sleep. She sat with her knees drawn close, staring at the quiet hum of the walls. She remembered the day of her capture. She remembered expecting teeth and claws, yet finding hands that offered her safety. She remembered Daniel telling her that confusion was the first step toward truth. She realized now that she stood at the edge of that step, and she had to decide whether to fall back into the comfort of fear or to leap forward into the unknown of trust. The following cycle she walked again to the mess hall. She felt the eyes of humans on her, but not with hunger, only with curiosity. Some of them offered smiles, some offered food. One even showed her how to use the strange metal tools to lift the grains from her plate. She felt warmth rising in her chest, and she whispered to herself, "These are not monsters." When Daniel approached her after the meal, she looked up at him and said with a shaky voice, "I want to believe, but if I stay, my people will hate me." The translator carried her words, and Daniel placed a hand over his chest, saying softly, "Belief is not easy. Truth is not easy, but sometimes you must stand against lies, even if others turn away." His eyes held no demand, only quiet strength, and she felt that strength pulling at her heart. Day of choice arrived when her people's warships appeared on the edge of human space. She saw them through the viewing screen. Sharp, dark vessels that filled her with memories of home, and yet also filled her with fear. because she now knew those who commanded them cared nothing for truth. The message came. Again returned the captive, her face wore. Lyra stood trembling in the command chamber as the human captain turned to Daniel. And then to her Daniel said once more, "It is your choice." She closed her eyes and felt her heart pounding. She thought of her people who raised her in fear. She thought of her elders who whispered lies, and she thought of the humans who gave her food, warmth and healing. She thought of Daniel's words, "You are safe," and she knew the answer. She turned toward the screen and spoke into the translator, her voice breaking but steady. "Enough humans are not monsters, they are not devourers. I have lived among them, and they have shown me kindness. My people have lied to us long enough." Her words spread across the channel, carried to her commanders, who now stared at her with rage. She could see their faces filled with disbelief and fury. They shouted through the connection, calling her broken, calling her traitor, calling her deceived, but she no longer trembled. She stood firm, her thin frame straight, her voice rising again. "I will not return to lies, I choose truth." The silence that followed was heavy. The human crew waited, their hands tense near their controls. The war could still begin, but something had changed. Lyra's voice had pierced through the dark veil of fear. Her people did not reply at once, and in that pause she felt the first spark of hope that maybe her choice had shaken the foundation of the lie. Daniel stood beside her and gave a nod of respect. He did not smile. He did not celebrate, for he knew the danger was not yet gone, but she felt his presence steady and strong. Like a shield beside her, she realized then that trust was not just a gift given. It was a bond built by courage and choice, and she had finally chosen. The shocking reality, the silence stretched across the command chamber as the image of Lyra's people remained on the screen, their faces twisted with anger. But beneath that anger, there was also something else. A flicker of doubt, perhaps, or fear of their own lies. Being spoken aloud in front of enemies they could not silence. The humans stood steady around her, their weapon systems ready. But Daniel's hand rested calm against the console, as if he trusted her words more than the threat of the fleet that waited. Outside, Lyra's chest rose and fell quickly as she struggled to breathe. She had never spoken against her leaders before, never imagined she would call them liars in front of strangers, yet the truth had forced itself from her heart, and once it was out she felt strangely lighter. She expected at any moment to be struck down by orders from her commanders, but instead the transmission cut without another word. The screen went black, and the warships that had loomed like predators in the dark held their position without firing. The humans watched in tense silence, and for long minutes nothing happened. Then one by one, the warships turned slowly, their engines glowing as they began to retreat back into the darkness. The human crew exhaled in relief, and some whispered in disbelief. Daniel turned his eyes to Lyra and gave a single nod, his voice steady through the translator. "You have saved many lives today." She stared at the empty screen, tears burning her eyes, because in choosing to speak, she knew she could never return to her world, not as the same person she once was. Her name would be cursed in her colony, her family told to forget her existence. Yet deep down she felt that she had finally broken free from the prison of fear. Days that followed were strange for Lyra. She no longer lived as a prisoner among the humans. They gave her a place of her own, a small cabin with a soft bed and light that could be dimmed when she wished. They treated her not as a captive, but as one of them, and though her voice still trembled when she spoke their words, she began to learn faster each cycle. She practiced with Daniel, repeating simple phrases until she could form small sentences without the machine, and each time she succeeded, he would smile and she would feel warmth grow inside her. The crew grew used to her presence. She was no longer the strange alien locked in a chamber. She became a figure they greeted in the corridors. Some even taught her small things like how to use the tools to fix a loose panel, or how to read the glowing maps on the console. She had never been trusted with such knowledge in her own world. Only the elders had such secrets. But here the humans shared freely, as if knowledge was not a treasure to hoard, but a gift to give. One night as she sat in the mess hall, Eating quietly, a soldier asked through the translator why her people feared humans so much. She hesitated, but then she answered with the truth. She had come to see because fear was power for her rulers. If the people believed in monsters among the stars, they would cling to their leaders for safety and never question the chains placed around them. The humans nodded in grim understanding. Some spoke of their own history, when lies and fear had once been used to divide them, and she realized then that humans too carried scars, yet they had learned to rise above them. Lyra began to see that the hunger of humans was not for flesh, it was for something greater. They hungered for knowledge, for discovery, for bonds with others. They hungered for the stars themselves, and that hunger had carried them further than fear ever could. She thought of the irony. She had grown up believing they would eat her body, yet what they truly consumed was the darkness of ignorance and the walls of lies. And they replaced it with light. Her trust in Daniel grew stronger with every passing day. He never treated her as fragile. Though he knew she carried fear, he encouraged her to speak and to learn. He invited her to walk the observation deck where the stars stretched endlessly, and told her that humanity's greatest dream was not to conquer, but to understand. She listened in silence, feeling her heart open wider to this vision of a future where fear did not rule. When news finally came that her people had retreated fully from the border, she felt relief but also sorrow. She knew she might never again see the caverns of her home, the familiar glow of her world sky, the faces of her kin. Yet she also knew that if she returned, it would be in chains of lies, and she could not go back to that prison. She had chosen truth, and there was no return from such a choice. On her final night aboard the ship, before their next long journey began, she stood again at the wide window, watching the stars, her reflection pale against the darkness. Daniel stepped beside her as he had done many times before, and asked in his quiet voice, "What do you see when you look out there?" She thought for a long time, then answered slowly, "I see freedom. I see a future I never knew existed. I see that I was wrong about your kind." He gave a small nod and said, "You were not wrong. You were only taught fear, and now you have broken it." She looked at him and felt something like gratitude and respect, and a bond that went beyond the walls of language. In that moment she realized the greatest shock of all was not that humans had spared her life, not that they had fed her or healed her, but that they had given her something her own people never had the chance to give her: the choice to see for herself, the choice to decide her own truth. She expected to be eaten by humans, yet instead she was saved by them, not only in body but in spirit. As the ship turned toward a new star and the engines roared beneath her feet, she whispered to the endless night, "I am not prey. I am not a captive. I am free." The stars shimmered back in silence, but she felt their answer in her heart, and for the first time since she was taken from her home, she smiled without fear, knowing that the story of monsters was over and a new story had begun. The end.